Ki te whare e tūnei tēnā koe, ki te whānau e hui nei tēnā koutou. Kapiti hono tātou hono te hono mate, ki te hono mate, kapiti hono tātou hono te hono ora, ki te hono ora. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Kia ora.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is James Robinson. I'm the regional archaeologist with Heritage New Zealand, and Rosalind persuaded me to give this talk after I was just going to help out with the field trip, but you know, no good deed goes unpunished. But I'd like to take this opportunity, and it will relate to my talk, to acknowledge Te Parawhau, Ngāti Wai and Ngāti Ka, who all have connections here, because you're actually having your conference in a very contested landscape where horticulture is the fundamental reason for that contesting, and also the fundamental reason for the large size of the population that was here. It makes sense as I go on, so come on. So Rosalind helped me write this prefix, so I suppose I better talk to it. So this concept is based on Te Tai Tokerau, which is the far north Northland, being the cradle for human settlement in Aotearoa, where over the last 700 years a range of exotic plants and trees were introduced.
No, you can't.
Okay. How about that? Any better? Okay, I shall talk loudly. Around 1300 AD, Polynesian settlers introduced and began growing taro and yams and gourds from Southeast Asia, and kumara from South America. This also cultivated native plants such as the bracken fern and tree crops like karaka. Now, 500 years later, European settlers brought a wide range of plants and tree species that originated from many places around the world. And I'm only going to cover some of them, but you know, fig, lemon, peach, pumpkin and potato. And commercial trade in some of these plants began as early as 1805, with the white potato along with salted and cast pork forming the basis of the first provisioning trade for the early whalers and sealers that visited this country in the early 19th century. A wider range of food plants were traded with Australia in the 1830s and then Auckland in the 1840s to the 1860s, after the capital moved from the Bay of Islands to Auckland in 1841. So horticulture today built on this foundation that has many connections to Northland. For 700 years it has been the foundation of social power and economic development throughout New Zealand's human history. While some of the plant introductions have been detrimental and have required in the 20th century the introduction of plant biosecurity measures, e.g. seeds and plants arrived, for instance, via Bay of Islands yachties, trade plants such as kiwi fruit and avocado, macadamia and rapeseed have, with varying degrees of success, began their introduction in Te Tai Tokerau and Northland. As such, horticultural developments in Northland region continue to benefit the nation as a whole. So that's the blurb. Now we get on to the fun stuff. 13,000 years ago, everybody was a hunter-gatherer. So you were dealing with plants and you're dealing with animals. But what happened was what's known as the Neolithic Revolution, which is where things happen. Now, this is my chance to take my being senior tutor for the Human Evolution paper at Otago, and I've got a nice audience here, so you have to suck it up. So there we go. So here we have a nice picture with nice colours and numbers on it, and that relates to thousands of years, and you can see how, over time, people have moved out. So, you know, from a base in Africa 200,000 years ago, you get these movements, and they make sense in terms of where you can walk is where you get the earliest dates. So it goes up here, you know, into Europe with Neanderthals and anatomically modern humans, over to China, and then, you know, 25,000 years ago into North America, across the Bering Sea, and of course Australia coming down here 65, maybe even earlier, 1,000 years ago, across that biological gap between Southeast Asia and Australia, between the marsupials on one side and the pygmy elephants on the other. And then you get this movement, as Arno talked about, of the Austronesian speaking people. That means we are Indo-European speaking people. Doesn't mean we'll come from India, but the connection is there through language, coming down out of Southeast Asia and sweeping through Melanesia and into the Pacific. And as you can see, it's only 1,000 years ago. And it's very obvious why, because it's so difficult to get here. You can't drift your voyage here 2,400 kilometers with a nice lot of food crops, plus auntie a full generation of people to make it viable. So let's have a look at this a little bit further. Next one. So that's us down the bottom. So these are the centres of domestication. So what happened after 13,000 years? We had the Holocene, which was a warming period, which we are still in at the moment. And weirdly, in various places around the world, you started to get the occurrence of crops which people were doing what you do, which is domestication in varying degrees. And the particular one that we're interested in comes out of China and Southeast Asia. And it comes down through Melanesia into the Pacific and ultimately down to Aotearoa, New Zealand. And they came on these waka, these doubled hora waka, and they were remarkably good sailing. But what the scientists have actually shown that this was deliberate, and it occurred over extending periods of distance. This is a whole other story in its whole right. But from a base in island Melanesia in the area of the Bismarcks and the Admiralties, where there was a large number of people making use of maritime technology, a certain group of people who we call the Lapita people, who moved out and traveled into Western Pacific, basically 150 kilometers in a boat, with good navigation, which doesn't sound much, but I've sailed to Great Barrier, it's a hell of a long way, and a viable population. And then their descendants, who we call the Polynesians, by the way, we call them the Lapita people because we don't know what their name is. It's based on a village in New Caledonia, where archaeologists worked out their pottery sequence. And then they moved, their descendants, and they moved out into as far as Fiji, Samoa and Tonga, New Hebrides, New Caledonia, distinctive pottery, distinctive crops that they brought with them. And then their descendants moved into the Eastern Pacific, and then ultimately to us. So here's the move. The red line shows the Lapita people coming in, and then there's a 1,000-year hiatus. And then the next big move was out to those blue lines, and that's what we call Eastern Pacific, what referred to today by traditional people in New Zealand as Hawaii, the place where we came from. And it's the Cook Societies, Marquesas, Tuamotus. They're so small on the map, when you look on Google Earth, you can't see them, because they're tiny places. What they did was they bound themselves together with a culture, which, because voyaging was very successful, that had couple of 1,000 years already, it allowed them to go to places where there was nobody there and make it their own. And they ultimately colonized a quarter of the world. So we know they got as far as South America. And the reason why we know that is because their crops that they had were all set from Southeast Asia. And we'll talk about those in a minute. But the one crop they didn't have, of course, was the white sweet potato, which it came back into Hawaii, and we have found it archaeologically dated to about 11 or 1200 AD. Thank goodness for New Zealand, because by the time it got to New Zealand, it became the dominant crop here for environmental reasons, and taro was not. Next one, please. So here we have those early domesticates, and as you can see, some of them are tree crops, and of course, in those days, they didn't know you had to have different names for what you did, so they all just domesticated whatever they could. They weren't too fussed about things. So next one. So these are the ones that sort of made it into the Pacific. And one of the interesting aspects of these is that the crops that come into the Pacific, as they sweep through from west to east, they don't all make it. When Arno talks about the highland coconut tree, that would have made it very well in New Zealand, but that wasn't part of the initial crop that they had. They had tropical coconut trees. And the coconut tree is a hugely valuable crop for a vast number of reasons, not just for the nuts. And so it didn't make it here. Similarly, when they brought back the sweet potato from South America, if they brought back the white potato, you can imagine the number of sites, archaeological sites around the country would have been as equal, not just Northland based from horticulture. So there's luck, there's survivability, and things like that. So as you can see on the right there, we got the dog, we didn't get the pig, and we didn't get the chicken, we did get the rat. Easter Island, for example, got the dog and the chicken, but didn't get the pig. So there's a whole lot of survivability issues. Okay. Next one, please. So here's your classic early domesticated plants that are relevant to us. You've got your yams, you've got your sweet potatoes, and your taro. Okay. Also, you have the tree crops, the bananas, the breadfruits, and the coconuts. And as has been talked today, some of those are now growing quite well in Northland. But then things have been warming up a little bit, you know. And don't forget, the issue about crops is not whether you can grow your crop, it's whether you can get a repeatability of growing your crop. You can grow taro on the west coast of the South Island. You just have a 1 in 6 years that is going to fail. And it's that predictability that allows for all societies to make use of it. So for example, in Southeast Asia, you have the monsoon, and the predictability of that allows for highly intensive rice and millet cultivation. And when you have a failure in the monsoon, millions of people die. Okay, next one, please. So, by the time the early Europeans got to New Zealand with Cook and Banks and Solander and, of course, Mary Dufresne, you know, these discovered gardens everywhere. So the settlers of New Zealand were horticulturalists in a traditional sense, in that they had multiple crops, because that's what you do for safety reasons. You can't afford to be a monocropper. All people who are monocropping here, there are others who do the other crops. So, you know, it's because it's a bigger population. So they had to do that. And so in the east coast of the North Island and in the far north, they found all sorts of gardens, but there was a boundary where they didn't find them to the south. And there were some very complex mechanisms for maximizing return, for avoiding weeds, all the things that you in your professional life would have fully recognized if you turned up on the HMS Endeavour at the time. Thank you. So these three were the big three that came to New Zealand. You have the taro on the left, the kumara in the middle, and yams to the right. Now, taro, you can find it growing in New Zealand, still feral, but there are areas in the far north of New Zealand, like up near Kaitaia, where the plains west of Kaitaia, when you're going to Ahipara, that is a reclaimed swamp, a lake called Tangonge, one of whose interpretations name is the shimmering taro leaves. So it's renowned for being highly productive. And don't forget, in the Pacific, taro is the dominant crop. It's got a higher carb loading, it's the preferred crop. When I was working in Whangārei in the Southern Cooks, they do have sweet potato, but they feed it to the pigs because it makes them taste good. So, and they have irrigated, reticulated systems to maximize their return. Okay? So, but yams were pretty borderline. We don't know much about yams. They disappeared very quickly. Awe is one of the names for it. But what we do know is that the white potato took over like that, and the name awe was in places transferred to this new crop. Because why put all this effort into a crop which is marginal the best of times? But kumara became dominant, but they had to use it, they had to do certain things to it, which you would recognize. Okay, next one. So this is the distribution of archaeological sites in New Zealand. These are places where people have left their history in the ground. And 90% of it is Māori archaeological sites, and they're closely associated with a climatic variant. So as you look south, you can see that there are some sites down here and here, but most of them in the north. And these are the kumara growing areas. And again, it's the reliability of production is the key thing. And when you get down to the borders of these areas, people come up with clever techniques to try and increase reliability. Next one. So here's how traditionally grown. They're called little pukes because mounds are quite valuable. They allow you to put decaying vegetation on the top. You also need a hard pan underneath to make the tubers bulk out with carbs. If you don't, you end up a bit like what happens in Kerikeri, which has got the most beautiful soil underneath New World and Countdown, which goes down 2 meters. But you need to put in a base, or else the roots go straight down. So this is a highly productive system. And then people did various things to make artificial versions of these. And mound gardens, the Chinese market gardeners of South Auckland were telling us back in the 1980s were 4 times as productive as flatland. The other thing you had to do was you had to store the kumara over winter. In the Pacific, you can leave it growing all year round, but the people who came here, as I said, were very good at voyaging, and they were very good at doing exactly what Cook and Banks did, which is to bring a whole bunch of experts in to work out what the variables are and how to deal with it and how to make a problem into an asset. So what they needed to do was to store the kumara over winter, because as people who don't grow kumara know, you stick it under your sink and it all turns to mush very quickly if it's too humid. So they made these underground hollows, little rectangles in the ground, and if the weather permits, we'll be going to see those, some giant ones of those up on Parihaka. And essentially what they're doing with this reconstruction is creating a climate control system. As you can see, the drain at the bottom, and they'll have drains on the outside to take the water off. There will be bracken fern or sand, anything to try and draw the moisture away. And it's one of the characteristics of New Zealand archaeology that those are found throughout the horticultural growing zone of kumara. Thousands and thousands of them. Okay. So let's have a look at some of the gardening systems that we know about in Northland. At Taimaru Bay, which is up just, if you know, Monganui Fish and Chip Shop, so it's across to the east of there. And as you can see here, this is an early 1900 photograph. There's the church, there's all these named pa, and then down here you can see the kumara growing on the sand. And up top is Sandra Heihe from Taimaru Bay with a patch of taro growing and remnant taro. So they're still using taro, but they're predominantly using kumara, but they do a bunch of crops. Next one. Now, Tawhiti Rahi, this is the name for the Poor Knights Islands. It's famous for its wonderful fisheries. The dive, people love it because it's got no sediment that comes off it, so you've got 100-metre visibility. It's got the highest biomass of fish in the world. It's got some of the most rare and endangered species in the world, like tuatara and giant weta, and the bellbird and things. But it's got a human history as well. Next one. These are the sorts of things when we talk about how can you make your gardens more productive. So if I said to market gardeners in Kerikeri or horticulturists in Kerikeri, you've got your big windbreaks. Well, one of the things you have is these long stone rows or stone mounds, and they're constructed to allow you to cultivate in between them, but also on them, because one of the crops they were using is the gourd, the bottle gourd, and they grow quite well on top of these mounds. So these are examples of stone and earth being used to create structures which will enhance the gardens. And in Whangārei, which was an amazingly fertile and productive area, and I lived there for many years, used to grow snails and anything and slime, and anything that will grow in that place. And it was a very contested landscape because it was this, you could get 2 crops out of it, and it was endlessly fought over, and it's not by chance that it's on the boundary between Ngāpuhi and Ngāpuhi, and that was endlessly fought over. Next one. So this is an example of a stone row. These islands were abandoned in 1823, and this archaeology is remarkably well preserved. So we actually, when we have stonefield archaeology, archaeologists can actually see things which you can't normally see. For example, we can't see kumara gardens from the DNA because we haven't yet worked out how to do that. We can't see kumara gardens from the pollen, which should be very distinctive. Unfortunately, they harvest it before it flowers, so we don't get that. So we are limited to seeing where they have the kumara pits to tell us where the kumara gardens were. So we're struggling a bit here. We understand that horticulture is the basis of all complex societies, as it is to ours today. And we struggle to find out where it is. So we managed to reconstruct some systems here on this island. So on this island, we managed to find there's what I categorised as horticultural areas, which are the green, the villages, which are the brown, some silver areas, which are stoneworking, working obsidian and things like that, and the red areas, which are ceremonial places, mostly urupa for burials. And this was a project done in partnership with Ngāti back in the early 2000s. So this area here, and that bit of green there, is one of the major 6 gardens on the island. Now what I've done using a GIS system is just to deconstruct what it's like. So this is the stream that runs through this area. Those little red dots are the artifacts from there. And one of the things we find with gardens is they don't have artifacts. Those are just accidental drops. The villages have the artifacts, the gardens don't. So, next one. So now I put back into it those stone rows. And you can actually see they start forming patterns here and here and here and up there. Next one. These are the stone mounds that are cleared from this rhyolitic volcanic litter of stones, and they pull them all together to make mounds. Next one. And then they create these facings, so they've got a slope, and then they've got a scarp, and then another slope. And they put stones on the face to stop erosion, control moisture. Next one. And those are stone platforms, and the next one. Those are the garden terraces where they were gardening in and around these mounds. The next one. And those are the occupation terraces where they're actually living. So, and then the next one, and that's just some strange stuff that was happening. This loose rock here, okay, that's unmodified rhyolitic volcanic stone fields. And what we found was because this island was abandoned overnight, they were in the process of expanding it. And so this here was the beginning of another one of these roads. They'd got 5 meters in place, they'd got the foundation course done, and they'd cleared all of the rock between here and here. But they hadn't gone outside. So we can see how families were expanding things. So each of those stone roads had a multiplicity of uses, which, you know, all good tree croppers know. You want one thing to do 5 jobs, because why pay for 5 things at a time? So there would have been probably windbreaks and things like that. But just like ownership issues today, these gardens had families which had rights to use. In many ways, very much like feudal England. Okay? Right to use, right to occupy, plus social organisation too, who has control over surplus and things like that. So this was quite interesting in terms of us trying to understand horticultural systems. So we have some really interesting ones in the north. And then we have places like Pouhere. This is at Karaka. If you ever drive up north and you turn right to get to Kerikeri, if you didn't, if you stayed on the road for another less than a kilometre, you'd see one of these volcanic mountains. And these volcanic mountains are these small ash cones, and they produce this fertile volcanic silt, highly well-drained, low to moderate fertility, quite suited for kumara production, and they form in this sea of clay, essentially. And so these focal points for settlement become intensely occupied. And if you next go past there and have a look, just look at the slope. It's not like this, it's terraced. Every bit of that is terraced. Now, Auckland has surviving 38 volcanic cones in a similar nature. Auckland City Council, back in 1902, decided to protect those for visual reasons. And all the gardens are now under houses. In the 1980s, we were investigating South Auckland, where all the commercial area was being developed. In South Auckland, all the volcanoes had been quarried away to make roading for Auckland, but the gardens were still there, so we had that. But Pouhere has got the volcano and the gardens still there. The Williams missionary family had that land. And of course, one of the things that happens after kumara has grown there is that the bracken fern, a native New Zealand plant that was used, comes in. And unless you've got mechanical ploughs, you can't get rid of it. So it was always been stocked. And so it's all there. And this is just a small section, when I say small, maybe a tenth of the garden fields of this volcanic fields. Those are stone mounds. These are garden lines in this little valley. That's the sort of contour line. So have a look at that, next one. And that's what it sort of looks like. So highly complex, highly intensified water color. Next one. So let's look at Awanui. So, in the far north, next one. So we believe this was used for the production of taro, though some of our ideas are starting to change. Sometimes, they're using multiple crops. They're making garden beds between wetland systems. Now here you can see from an aerial photograph the drains. Now these are not like the taro systems of Whangārei, which were reticulated water, irrigated water. These are flood control. In other words, they never have too little water, and so why bother bringing it in if you've always got enough water? You generally have too much water. And so this whole system appears to be designed to pull water away when it floods. And so you have your drains and your mounds, and maybe you grow your kumara on the mounds and your taro on the drains. In Whangārei, we have remnants of this type of system on Limestone Island, where you can see those drains if you've ever been on it. Limestone is a very thin soil, but you mound up the soil on it, and they love the hard pan with the limestone. They get great productivity out of it. And in Portland and things like that, we've got lots of examples of huge parasites relating to this system, which we don't know very much about. Next one. This is a reconstruction of Māori, which is a bay on the northwest side of Moturua Island in the Bay of Islands. And this is an area that's been excavated for a number of years. And there's the early settlement along the beachfront and then gardens at the back. And we're finding the same sort of gardening systems there that are found in central Waikato. There's Pouhere gardens and then generalised soil gardens. And we think it's all to do with kumara, but we're still working on it. We're not quite sure. We know that when European crops came in, they were enthusiastically adopted. We know about the trade, for example, feeding Auckland from the Waikato is very famous, but who knows about the trade of feeding Auckland from Northland? There were canoe loads of peaches coming down to Mechanics Bay. There were paintings of them, this canoe that's a single hull canoe piled high. This has just come, 200 kilometres in, coastal waters to feed into the Auckland market. And the early systems of trade in New Zealand, for example, the earlier ships that were built in the Hokianga, it was to tie into the Australian market because all of the starving convicts, basically, there wasn't enough food. And so the chiefs over here thought, this is a good idea. Got some boat builders, made a few things. So it's, I'm wanting to say that what you're doing is really important. What I'm saying is what you're doing is what other people have done as well. And that it is the foundation of society. So in this great computerized age, don't get too carried away. It's what you're doing is really important. Now, what about tree crops? Now, we have Aute, which is the paper mulberry, and the karaka. I haven't mentioned Te Pouhere, which of course is the cabbage tree. Now that was interesting because the cabbage tree became quite important in the South Island, where the taproot could be cooked in an earth oven, and after 48 hours, it's about 25% fructose. So very valuable in a place where you can't grow other stuff. But they brought a Pacific variant in, which is called tea. But then and there's still a couple of them around in New Zealand, but mostly they use the New Zealand one. So they adopted a New Zealand tree as a tree crop. Now, Aute, so let's have the next slide. So here's Aute. It's familiar in the Pacific. You take the bark and you process it like paper making to make tapa cloth. Okay. Now here you can see the tapa cloth beaters. They're rectangular. They're quite different from the fern root beaters that you'll see in various museums. And there's quite a few of those turning up around Whangārei. Now, there's an example of tapa cloth from the Pacific. Very beautiful. When Sir Joseph Banks in 1769 was in the Bay of Islands, he saw the paper mulberry crop growing, and he saw tapa cloth being made. But it pretty much disappeared very quickly. So it's a remnant of that early Polynesian arrivals that was still continuing, but it disappeared quite quickly. So it's a tree crop. It was grown. We know very little about it. It hasn't survived. Next one. Okay. Now, one of my colleagues, Justin Maxwell, lives up at Wanganui. currently runs the Old Oak Inn. If you like to go to a very old-fashioned 1860s building, if you're very short, you'll like it upstairs. You won't bang your head going through the doors because they're only 5'5" tall. But he did his thesis on the karaka tree, specifically on the Chatham Islands. Now, there's some interesting things about the karaka nut. As you know, up here you can find it, but its original distribution was Whangārei north. And you can still find some undomesticated karaka trees. You'll see them and go, why are the nuts so small? Who would think that if you actually select for certain things, nuts can get bigger? The fruit, it tastes a bit like apricot, but the nut, despite having toxins in it, is a super nut. It contains pretty much everything you need to survive, and that's only been really worked out by the geneticists in the last 10 years. So from that distribution above that red line, it's now found throughout New Zealand. And it's found on the Chatham Islands, and it's found on the Kermadec Islands. Now, some of that, for archaeologists, is quite interesting. The Kermadec is like a halfway house between Hawaii Pacific, homeland, and New Zealand. Not only has the karaka been found there when it's not native there, it's been introduced, so somebody brought it there, along with certain types of obsidian from New Zealand. So it's clear connections back that we see in the physical record. But they found it on the Chatham Islands. And that's quite important because it's a place where you cannot grow kumara reliably. Here's the Chatham Islands. Here's an example of its Māori name as, or Moriori name as Rekoho. And those are the settlement sites with the traditional names around it. When I was at university, we were told the 2,000 people who were there prior to the invasion from Taranaki tribes were living off fish and seals and whales that came ashore. We couldn't quite make sense out of that because it didn't seem to make much sense to us from a point of view, but archaeologists weren't very good at numbers, so we thought, oh, well, it's worth a try. And then, next slide. But then we found these. These are an excavation of shell middens. So this is where people are actually processing shellfish. So, okay, got shellfish, they got fish. It's got a very high biomass of fish. It's a great place to live. It's got seals, you can eat those. But so here, for example, is the broadleaf forest in the dark green. Now, what happened here is they introduced the karaka tree, and we can work that out from the pollen cores where we reconstruct the vegetation. And they maintained the broadleaf forest to give it protection. And then the management of those forests became a bit like in Whangārei in the Southern Cooks. It was all about management and control of this resource, which allows you to support, oh, I don't know, 2,000 people. Next one. And here's some of the karaka trees that were introduced. And here's one of the dendricals. It's known as Māori. And they're carved faces. It's the only place in New Zealand where we find those. And it's because they're very important. 10 minutes? Thank you. Nearly there. And so the next one. And where those trees are is where the sites are, where the villages are, where the archaeology is. It's what they call the smoking gun. You know, there is a clear connection here. It just, sadly, the New Zealand archaeologists of the day didn't know much about trees. If they'd talked to you guys, you probably would have been able to advise us and saved us 10 years of wasted effort. So next one, please. So I'd like to end with an opportunity. I acknowledge that we're getting warmer temperatures, but you've got opportunities here for this tree, which is known to grow in the deep south. You've got the fruit that tastes like apricot that you can do things with. You've got the nuts, if you process it properly and get the toxins out, provides some amazingly stable and apparently very tasty food. It has not been used anywhere near a commercial crop as far as I know. The distribution of those karaka tree around New Zealand, they're often associated with parasites and stuff, but interestingly, not in the open, but in little gullies, little protected areas. In other words, there's a very clear understanding of what they need to do to maximize their return. So, you know, I think we should be thinking about native plants. You've got hinau berries, you've got miru berries and stuff like that. And one of the byproducts of maybe commercialising it is that you'll better protect them, because the more we have, the better we'll be, if we don't want to lose them in the wild through natural problems like that. So I leave that with a challenge to everyone, but I haven't talked about the European history of plants, which is all very interesting in its own right, but I think that's enough. So thank you very much.
Down. At one point they talk about that. Seeing it was native to the northern region.
So the biological evidence from to the best of my knowledge, from the botanists in New Zealand, is the consensus of opinion it is native to New Zealand. It's a remnant of an ancient forest that was shrank back up to the north for a variety of reasons. We don't know why. Doesn't seem to be elsewhere. It seems to have been introduced elsewhere. And that's the problem in the early historic period. Stuff moves around very fast. We think so. Okay, but we could be wrong, but that's what we think so.
How was the toxin taken out of the nut?
So there's a variety of processes. Essentially, these days, you boil it for 12 hours, but in the old days, you would put it in nets and have it in a stream for like about 2 or 3 days, and it slowly processes out. So it's not something that if you eat one, it'll kill you, but if you eat a bunch of them, it will kill you. But, you know, boil it, basically boil it. So.
They tell me that ancient Māori used the karaka tree leaves to store the taro, and until in wintertime, and the taro would eat itself, in a sense that the karaka tree leaves rotted and would feed the plant during that process.
That makes a lot of sense.
My interest is, Captain Cook referred to 3 useful plants that Māori grew. You gave them taro, kumara, and uwhi yam. You call it something else.
Awe is a Pacific term. I apologise. It should be uwhi. My apologies.
They big things like that.
Well, the yams we had were quite small, but in the Pacific there's 3 varieties, and you get giant yams and small ones.
I remember the King of Tonga, a really big guy.
Yes.
Doctor told him just eat 1 or 2 yams a day.
But this again is the survivability of what comes to New Zealand. There is actually a DSIR connection to kumara, which is that the native New Zealand kumara mostly died out in a blight in the 1940s. But Doug Yen, who worked at DSIR, the ancient DSIR, was collecting them to try and propagate them, to preserve them. And there was a change in direction at DSIR. He was told to get rid of all this stuff. So he took them back to Tokyo University. And in 1996, there was a hikoi who went over there and they returned to New Zealand. And some of them are growing up at the airport in Whangārei. And some are growing on the south coast in the Wairarapa, where there are traditional kumara seasons. And I was lucky enough to see a presentation by Birkinshaw, who showed this lovely little picket fence with these beautiful green kumaras growing, and there was this brown hills in the background. And I said, so what's happening here? So we're 1 in 100-year drought. So I said, oh, did you water them? He said, no, they're sort of hydrophytic. They get all the moisture they need from fogs and dew. And so you've got a highly drought-tolerant plant that doesn't require high fertility, doesn't rip the soil like white potato. It's got a great future. So anyway.
I thought I'd just briefly mention, if anyone's interested in reading about the detoxification of karaka, there's a thesis from the University of Waikato from 2013 by Jessica McCaskill. Long story short, leaching you can leach the toxins, but there's still a little bit left, and apparently it's slightly neurotoxic. So maybe we can look at breeding lower. Anyway, it's a thesis from 2013 by Jessica McCaskill, spelled MacAskill, in case anyone was interested.
And that work was actually sponsored by Tree Crops.
They're doing these presentations.
I just want to comment on this because I was years ago taught. I'm doing my best. Years ago, when I was in my 20s, I was taught in Pouhere Bay on the east coast how to process karaka by an old Māori woman, and we did it together, and I ate the results, and they were fabulous. And so the process is this: you boil them, but just boiling alone is not enough. You then put them in a kete or a sack and leave them in the stream for a week or two, and that's the leaching process. So the boiling, I think, like releases the toxins, and then they have to be leached out. So I think it's very important because they are incredibly toxic if you eat them. I mean, they can cause convulsions and distortions of the limbs and all kinds of terrible stuff. So you must leach the toxins out for a long period of time.
Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's really interesting. As we've been talking, as we've been talking about, my great-grandfather grew 15 varieties of kumara and potato up here on the hill in Monu, and a lot of them are now lost. Thank you.
Can I just finish with the field trip that's going today? We're going to go to Tawhiti, where there is a whole raft of archaeology to look at. And anyone coming on that bus trip, please feel free to grab one of these handouts. It'll help you when you're there. But it's been a great pleasure to be asked to be here, and I would acknowledge all the hard work that everyone does, and it's great fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much.